Would someone like to begin by sharing their holiday story?
Patty, do you want me to break the ice? I'll break the ice.
Great, thank you, Joan.
You bet. Hi, everybody. So, my grandmother lived on the Grand Concourse in what had been an elegant building and was in the late 60s showing its age. It had tiled floors and hard walls so that our voices echoed when we played in the hallway. My grandmother lived on the 6th floor. Across the hall was her sister Jean. Downstairs was my father's Uncle Mo and his wife, Aunt May. Great Uncle Sam and Aunt Frida were on another floor. My grandmother, as the second oldest child and oldest daughter, was the matriarch. She was the soul of the family, and she was the cook. Oh, and she was the baker too. So Rosh Hashanah for me is about large family gatherings when the folding table was opened down the 2 steps in the sunken living room. The best tablecloths and dishes were set. I have those dishes today. We gathered around the table, and my father was always given the honor of being at the head, even though his elder uncles were there, but no one would suggest to my grandmother otherwise. Dinner began with chicken soup. There was gefilte fish and pot roast. There were potatoes and some vegetables, but my most vivid memory is of dessert. Grandma would bake a lemon meringue pie. I can still taste the tart lemons and the sweet meringue. But even better was a dessert Grandma didn't make, a dessert we only had at Rosh Hashanah. But first, the guests. The guests around the table included my cousins from Baltimore and the great aunts and uncles from the building. And there was always one other guest, someone we only saw at Rosh Hashanah and Passover, Sidney Pepperbloom. Sidney was my father's brother's wife's father, or my grandmother's machatonu. He was a widower, and my grandmother always invited him for the holidays. I don't remember him at all. I couldn't tell you what he looked like or if he was nice, although I assume if he wasn't, I'd remember that. I was a kid, and I really didn't care, except that he always brought a special dessert, Taglish, a dessert I never saw at any other time. Sweet baked balls of dough, drizzled in honey, formed into a tower, and sprinkled with nuts. I vividly remember my sticky fingers as I played with and ate the Taglish. I might not remember Sidney Pepperbloom or which vegetables my grandmother served, but Taglish I remember. And a special thank you to Karen for reminding me even more of Taglish yesterday.
Yeah, we learned how to make it last night.
What a sweet story.
Thank you.
Literally. It really is.
Can you track down
memories are the most basic
track them down
memories.
for a recipe?
Karen made it.
I know.
I'm sorry, Kathy, what did you say?
Food memories are the most basic memories. They touch things so primal, really. And you know, like everything else is almost intellectual. This isn't intellectual. This is deeply physical and emotional tied together.
Great, thank you. Vera, do you have a story you'd like to share?
Well, I think this is going to be not so exciting because in Hungary, I barely knew I was Jewish. And so you were between my parents being Holocaust survivors and being a communist country, we didn't celebrate any Jewish holidays, even though my mother came from a religious, an Orthodox family in Transylvania. It was really better not to have holidays. Politically, it was much better and safer not to have holidays. So I knew nothing about it. But we did have a maid in a maid's room, and we had a Christmas tree for the maid. So I knew a little bit about Christmas. It wasn't for us, it was for her. So I knew that was different. But basically I knew nothing about, I knew in concept that I was Jewish, but we celebrated nothing Jewish. And then I got to Israel and I met a lot of cousins. And really the most memorable holidays were the Passover Seder. And all of a sudden I had this big family, and gefilte fish was made from fresh fish that was swimming in my aunt's bathtub. It would be really fresh.
Oh, God.
Mhm.
It was gefilte fish, and nobody has ever made such a good gefilte fish ever since.
Oh.
So I learned, but on one of the first high holidays in Israel, when we were in this temporary housing, I must have been a really rebellious child, because it was Yom Kippur, and I took all the kids my age out of synagogue, brought them to my house, and gave them food, because you were
Oh.
so fast. So, in Israel, a lot of people are not very religious, and we weren't. So really my first religious experiences were at the Shul of New York. And yeah, and I was very, very moved, very moved. I mean, I used to tell Rabbi Bert that every high holiday he would levitate, because it felt like he was levitating. And it was very meaningful to me, because it was really the first introduction.
Well, it was a good one. Okay.
You never went to the Hungarian synagogue in Budapest?
The Hungarian synagogue is where my parents met each other. That beautiful, beautiful synagogue in Budapest.
Yeah.
That's where they met each other. I went back as a tourist. I never went as a child, but I went back as a tourist, as an adult tourist, several times. Yeah.
It was Nazi headquarters.
Yeah.
That's
Yes.
why it wasn't destroyed.
Yes. It's on Dohányutca, which means Tobacco Road. And that was also a Jewish section in Budapest.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else have a story to share about? Yeah, Carol.
Well, I think mine is less a story and more memories. And I see Sarah's on, so she's heard my stories before. I have, I think, three very sharp memories when I think of the high holidays. The first is my grandmother. My grandmother coming to the house just before Rosh Hashanah. And take a look at us. We're grandmas. My grandma didn't look like this at all, at all. She was a real grandmother from the old country, just the way you want a grandma. And she would walk into the house, I always remember this, with two shopping bags. Within 15 minutes, there was paradise on the table. There was more food than my mother ever had in a year on the table. This spread from these two little shopping bags. And it was just, you talk about food being so visceral, so, part of you and these holidays. Well, this was my grandmother, and then later on, my grandmother became the cook, the person who kept my father and uncle in business. Actually, put them in business in an appetizing delicatessen, more appetizing on 72nd and Broadway. So like the first 24-hour appetizers that stayed open, but it was Mama's cooking that everyone went to there. So that's my heart warmer for the holidays. And the other one, my parents, we were not religious. We practice traditions, but we're not religious. But I remember Yom Kippur. I remember my father in a supine position on the couch. And my mother would say to me, Carol, your father's fasting. But I saw him watching the ball game, That's what my father did Yom Kippur. And I had ball game and fasting all mixed up for a very long time until someone straightened it out. And the other thing I remember was my mother was of the type. She would, for Rosh Hashanah, dress us up. And I remember every year we were given a black velvet dress with Mary Jane's, the little Mary Jane shoes, the patent leather shoes. It must have been cooler during then, because I remember a spring coat. You would be wearing your first spring coat, and my mother would buy us a hat. And we had a housekeeper, and the housekeeper, my mother would say to the housekeeper, take the girls across the street to the temple. We had a temple directly across the street. Building, a park, the temple. And we were told to stand there most of the day. And we would never go in. And what was important for my mother was when we came back, when the housekeeper picked us up and came back, my mother would stand there and say, you know, Carol, Mrs. Katzman saw you all dressed up there. She thought you looked so good. And clearly my mother was into this a lot. And then my mother's next words were, all right, and what did Mrs. Lubinsky wear? And what about her children? So I seem to be this catalyst for my mother's gossip. But that was my memory of Rosh Hashanah. My mother dressing us up, putting us someplace, and having us come back for a pot full of compliments.
It's great. Those are great.
Yeah, Barry.
Mine are much like Carol's, olfactory smells. I remember the brisket, the smell of brisket and kasha varnishkis. And it had I was too young to know what it meant, but I always heard first cut brisket. You know, it's only now that I'm an adult that I learned what first cut was. It was the best cut of the brisket. But my wife and I, Kathy and I, went back to our old neighborhood on our anniversary, the beginning of August, to a little store called the Kanishnosh. If anybody grew up in Forest Hills, Karen, you can remember. Well, if you like kasha varnishkis, theirs was terrific. You don't like it. But it reminded me of that which my mother made.
Barry, we called it bow ties and gravel when I was a kid.
It was bow ties, but it wasn't gravel. I guess your mom didn't make it the same way.
My mom was not a great cook.
Oh no, my mother was a good cook, as was my dad. But the other memory I have is my mother always made gefilte fish, and I don't remember the fish swimming in the bathtub. I think she brought home the fish from the fish market. But I always remember her saying that the prices went up the week of the high holidays. That, you know, if you'd bought the fish the week before, it was a different price. But that week, taking advantage of the marketplace, the prices went up. But friends of ours make gefilte fish, and we celebrate the holidays with them. But they only use 2 of the 3 fish, and it never ever tastes the same. If you don't use whitefish, carp, and pike, you got to use all 3. Anyway, food is my memory.
Barry, did you grow up in Forest Hills?
I did.
I did. We lived across the street from Forest Hills Jewish Center.
You on Queens Boulevard?
Yeah, on Queens Boulevard.
We lived a few blocks away, right off Queens Boulevard and 68th Drive.
Did you go to Forest Hills High School?
I did, as did my wife, Kathy, who's sitting behind me.
Hello, Kathy. What year?
I was 63. Kathy was 64.
I was 65.
65. Okay, you're
Don
right.
and I lived off Queens Boulevard and 108th Street and 65th Avenue in Forest
Oh, my.
Hills.
Ah,
That was much later. I was 20 years later.
But you went to Forest Hills High School, right? Karen, you went to Forest Hills High School?
Me? No, I grew up on Staten Island. I was just going to say I see the potential for some kind of a reunion that the Shul will run
Joan, you went to Forest Hills High School, right?
No, no. So Don and I moved there when we were married. I went to John Adams High School in Ozone Park.
Okay.
So didn't Paul Simon go to Forest Hills High School?
He
Yes.
did. He did. He's 5 or 6 years. Both Garfunkel and Simon went to Forest Hills High School, and they
Both
were
did. Wow.
extremely, extremely good students. Very smart.
And later on, the Ramones.
I'll tell a story out of school. My mother was the school secretary, and she looked up their grades, and she said they were better than mine. They were really good.
One of them went to Columbia, right? Garfunkel.
I think Garfunkel did. Yeah, yeah. They lived in Kew Gardens. I don't know where.
They lived not far on 108th Street. There were those attached townhouses.
Yes.
That's where they lived. And I know they went to Queens College. I don't know what happened
Queens
after.
College, yay!
Yeah.
I have bad memories of Queens College. They did not accept me. So, twice. So I'm not a fan of Queens College, but I graduated from NYU. I'm a fan of NYU.
Good for you.
Joan, I'll have to get you some good kasha varnishkis. Maybe you'll appreciate it.
You will. I'm holding you to it.
It won't be gravelly.
Mhm. Ayla, do you have a story you'd like to share? You're muted. We can't hear you. You have to unmute. We can't hear you.
Can
There
you
you are.
Okay, Ayla,
Oh, I'm sorry.
it's fine. A story. I mostly tuned in to listen because it's
Good.
my way of being in community. What can I say? I mean, I can remember being with my paternal father's family in Brooklyn, a distance from where we lived in Brooklyn, and my cousins and grandparents and my parents, and there's a long row of card tables strung together. I remember that the kids didn't understand much of what was going on, but I remember a very special chicken soup and also chocolate chip cookies where the chocolate chips were M&Ms. So when you bit into them, the little shell would break and you get this warm chocolate in your mouth. My parents were not very religious at all, but we would attend a few holiday dinners with family. And so that was what I recall. And also I would go to synagogue with my maternal grandfather. I would walk a distance within our Brooklyn community, which was called Manhattan Beach. And I would go and stand with my maternal grandfather in the men's section because my parents and other relatives did not go to synagogue. So in order to be with somebody, I'd be with my grandfather, and I was very much in awe of his righteous stance and his observance. And for me, at that point, when I was a young child, standing beside my grandfather, Hebrew was the language of God. And I didn't understand any of it, but I was just, I was so much in love with my grandfather, Abraham, that I just would sort of reap some of his piousness. So that's what I can say.
Sounds like it was an amazing experience for a young child to just be
Yeah.
there and absorb it. Yeah.
It was.
Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Mhm.
Kathy?
It's interesting because my mother and father grew up very religious, and then they just walked the heck away. And I was very religious as a child. I went to Riverdale Temple, which is where I met Rabbi Bert. And really, you know, I remember participating in services. I do not remember any family occasions with the holidays. I realized that when you're talking about it, I'm like, wow, that's weird. I remember Passovers, lots of Passovers where the first night we're at one grandparent's house, and the second night we'd be at the other grandparent's house, and there's all this like drama about which night each grandparent got. But the interesting thing is, I'm married to Raleigh, who is half Jewish. His father's Jewish, his mother was Methodist, but he's an amazing cook. So as soon as we got together, he would do the breakfast meal, and he'd do brisket and potatoes and carrots, and he makes an amazing brisket. I mean, it's like a whole production number. And I was like in awe because my mother was a horrendous cook. I mean, if beef wasn't like brown black, it was the wrong color. Everything was brown black. So it was like not a pleasant experience. But for me, the high holidays is Raleigh's brisket, quite frankly. So again, food memories are really important. A Passover, lots of memories, but for some reason, not the high holidays, which is kind of weird and unusual to me, but so be it.
To compare his brisket to Dawn's.
Okay, we could do that, or we could just accept that they're both wonderful.
It could be, yeah.
Yeah, they're both wonderful.
Good. Thank you for sharing. Kumba, would you like to share a story? Kumba?
Okay, I will. Actually, I came to the United States in the 90s. It was very funny because I was living with my cousin who was actually doing a graduate program at NYU and working in a nursing home. And he says, oh, the nursing home is a Jewish nursing home. It belongs to Jews. I was surprised. I said, Jews exist out of the Bible and out of the Holy books. I mean, I'm ashamed to say that, but that's the first time I really realized that, you know, there are actually Jewish people, because this is before internet and everything else in the early 90s, you know, and then now I'm married to one. And I did spend this weekend with my mother-in-law and her 89-year-old boyfriend. And on Shabbat, I did bring this up, you know, because of today. I said, okay, I asked my mother-in-law, what was your tradition, you know, high holiday tradition growing up? You know, her parents weren't that religious, you know, she says, you know, but the good thing is, you know, she did send all of her 3 children to, you know, not Jewish schools, but they did actually study Judaism and have their bat mitzvahs and everything else, you know. And then my, the boyfriend who is 89 was like, you know, we didn't, according to him, his mother was very religious, extremely, to a point where you can't mix milk and everything is kosher. You know, he says, as soon as I reached college age, I was out of that house, you know, and I'm gone, you know. So fast forwarding to today, you know, as of 2013, what we normally do is, you know, me and Michael will sometimes meet up with his sister, you know, but all we do is, you know, apple and honey. You know, so with the high holidays, we do fast 24 hours, you know, for Yom Kippur, you know, and so now, because my reason for talking to my mother-in-law is knowing more about the culture, you know, and try to incorporate it into our lives today, because she's 80 years old. Her boyfriend is 89 years old. They are not going to be here forever. You know, to learn, and they are people who don't talk about anything. They're like this, you know. So I just wanted to know as much as I could, you know, and just to incorporate everything into my life. And then I ended up teaching them Musa and Elul and everything I learned from Rabbi Eva, you know, including the 13 attributes, you know. So But yeah, that's basically my story. So I'm just adding on as the years go by, and as I learn as much as I could, just incorporating everything. So hopefully one day I'll have a big story to tell.
But that is a big story.
Yeah, you already have a big
Tradition. I
story.
think that's amazing.
Right.
Bravo.
Mhm.
And many of us are in similar circumstance where we continue to add to our traditions and learn more about it. So you're not alone. Sarah, hi. You're muted. You're muted.
I wasn't brought up knowing about any holidays. Okay. I mean, I was once sent on Purim to the temple. It's the only time I was in the temple, and they were doing flags and apples. I had no idea what it was about. So then when I was about 10, my mother sent me upstairs to the landlady's house to go to the Seder. But she didn't tell me what a Seder was. I didn't know any of the people. And then they made me drink Manischewitz wine,
Mm.
which I thought was the worst thing I ever tasted in my life. So I came downstairs and I told my mother I did not want to be Jewish. Because if I had to drink Manischewitz wine, no way. So it wasn't until I went to my second husband's family for Passover that I understood what some of the traditions were.
And the importance of Manischewitz.
Well, I never drank that again, but
Depends what year it is. Some years are very good.
really,
I love Manischewitz. It's a guilty pleasure for years and years. That's
Really?
the only
Oh my
wine
God.
we had. And then I finally found there was kosher, decent wine. And I started to bring
yes.
that to Passover, and everyone was like, oh my God, you could have wine that tastes like wine?
Exactly.
The
Yeah.
first time I ever got drunk was Passover, and I was about 8 years old. I remember it fondly.
Well, I wish I had gotten drunk, but anyway, I love all the holidays and I celebrate all holidays.
Yeah. It's nice to come to it in adulthood. Yeah.
Well, I wish hearing all your stories, it's so touching to me, and I really feel sad that I didn't have that,
Right.
but can't have everything.
Karen, are you still
But one
here?
of the things is we can create it for ourselves now. I mean,
That's
one of the beautiful things is you can make any tradition you like now. You have the freedom to do that.
Yes,
you
and
know?
So my story is a little different. I grew up in a small town in Connecticut that didn't have a synagogue when I was young.
which
And
town?
Westport.
Uh-huh.
And now it's very Jewish, but we were like the third or fourth Jewish family there in 1953. And there was a congregation, but we had the high holidays in a church. We met in the congregational church, and so I kind of with a more ecumenical approach to religion. But then I married Rob, who, I don't know if any of you read, but his father was the volunteer cantor at the University of Connecticut's Hillel. And do you want to tell about your dad?
Yeah, but before I do that, one thing I learned from this discussion is that gefilte fish isn't restricted to Passover. I've never heard of it being eaten during the high holidays.
Me
This
too.
is just, so we have these jars that we just keep from year to year for Passover. Now I know that I can actually open those jars up for.
It's to the Manischewitz.
And whenever our kids would bring a non-Jewish partner to Passover, we'd give them the gefilte fish test.
That's right.
And if they managed to get it down without gagging, they were good.
It's in the Bible. You can eat it every day.
I knew that was true of chorosis. I never knew about gefilte fish.
We have a son-in-law, Rob, who's Catholic, and he loves gefilte fish. You can't give him too much.
Well, that's funny. And the only other food, most of what I'm going to say is more spiritual, but the only other food tradition that we've started since we joined the Shul of New York, so it's probably been about 12 or 13 years, is that our food fest before Kol Nidre is Katz's. We go to Katz's before
Yeah.
Kol Nidre, and a corned beef sandwich at Katz's with some matzo ball soup. You don't want to eat for 48 hours to get 24 hours.
Good idea.
So we even have our own table there. We've been doing this for so many years.
This year's going to be hard without cats.
We may still go to Katz's. Anyway, so my father, who had a very traditional upbringing, went to yeshiva, grew up in Bensonhurst in Brooklyn. His parents were very Orthodox, not the Hasidic or Lubavitcher, but very, very Orthodox. And then he got a job teaching at the University of Connecticut in stores in 1948, 2 years before I was born. And he and the other handful of Jewish faculty, of which there may have been half a dozen, started a Hillel and actually had a building built. And because at the time he was the only person on the faculty who actually knew Hebrew, that he volunteered to run the high holiday services and be the cantor and be, but this is before we had a rabbi. He was kind of like, doing it all, cantor, rabbi, and doing it all through as a volunteer. And this is both for the faculty, but also for the Jewish students at UConn. And as I think about it, I think one of the reasons he may have decided to do this is to avoid having to go back to Brooklyn for the high holidays. If he was running the services, he had a legitimate excuse about why he didn't have to go drag us all to Brooklyn for the drudgery of an Orthodox service. And this was safe haven because he was obviously performing something important for Judaism, but so he had a totally legitimate excuse. And it turns out he had a beautiful voice. He never really sang, in any other kind of venue, but he had a beautiful melodic voice. And his Kol Nidres were,
Beautiful.
very, very moving, piercing, haunting. It's almost like he was singing and playing the cello at the same time. I remember he used to listen to Jan Pierce recordings of Kol Nidre and try to capture some of the beauty of. I don't know if anyone's that name rings a bell at all, but he was kind of a famous chanter of Kol Nidre. And he also did some kind of funny things. He, there's the various Kaddishes that are performed during the service. Most of them are pretty serious, but there's the Reader's Kaddish, which he would always speed read, and we'd literally come with a stopwatch.
Our kids would time him.
Time him on how fast he would get through the Reader's Kaddish. And he also did a beautiful rendition of a tune at the end of Yom Kippur called Hayom, 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 Hayom. And in fact, at his memorial service, even though it was nowhere near the Jewish holidays, all the children sang that kind of in his honor. So it was.
But the kids used to. There's only one word in the song for most of the song, and the kids used to count how many times he would say Hayom in any song. So they were always in the front row to see their grandfather. So the holidays became very special, especially for me, from going from church, where it was pretty anonymous, to joining this family that was way more observant than my family, and being able to participate with my father-in-law's and my children's grandfather as the cantor.
Did you ever go to the very Orthodox families, Seder?
No, never. I never went to services with my grandparents. Never.
Wow, that's
we dreaded when they came because we couldn't do, and Shabbat we could never do anything. So, so my father did this from 1949 through to 1999, the year before he died.
Wow.
He ran high holidays for 50 years. So, in the beginning, it was more out of obligation. We were little. We really didn't want to go and kind of drag there. But as time went on, it became really memorable. And as Patty said, when we lived in Baltimore for 12 years, so we didn't always make it back for the high holidays. But then once we moved to Katona in 1980, we would go, virtually every year and bring our children. So the next generation got to appreciate him, and really, I think, came to value how meaningful he made the services be.
And then in Katona, we belong to a Havara, and for Rosh Hashanah, we would do Taglish. And so we'd go to a pond in town with 8 families and take breadcrumbs. And we'd all stand around the pond with all the children and go through the alphabet and think of something terrible for every letter of the alphabet and throw bread to the ducks in the pond. And so like for A, it could be like avarice, and B would be bigotry, and C, and the kids would come up with what the words were and go through that. It was just, the kids loved it. It was so much fun. And so then after our Havara disbanded, and we have grandchildren, now every year we take our grandchildren to a pond and have them do it. And, you know, some of them are very little, so they come up with very funny things.
Like what?
The alphabet. Oh, poo, like P would be poop or something, you know. I mean, you know, something that a 4-year-old would think is funny, right? So that's one of our current traditions, is to do that with our children, our grandchildren. So, yeah. Anyone else have a story to share, or thought, or some idea about something fun? Rob has always had this great idea that,
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, he thinks breakfast should be a barbecue instead of bagels, but that hasn't
Well, I
quite
heard
caught on.
brisket though, brisket for breakfast.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
close.
I forgot to say something very Yom Kippur that had a tremendous impact on my life. And that was at the Village Temple, actually, with Rabbi Math. And before there was a Shul of New York, my WASP Goy from Illinois husband and I, as we were we were thinking about getting married, we went around to various spiritual houses to see which one might appeal to us. And we went to a Yom Kippur service, which was held at the Cooper Union for the Village Temple. And several older people fainted that day from fasting, which my mother always told me you're not supposed to fast if you were older or sick, that it was.
Right.
So my WASP husband must have been very moved by it. Might have been his first Yom Kippur ever, because we went home and he got on his knee and he proposed that day.
Wow, what a great story.
What year is this, Vera? What year?
So that would be 1987.
Wow. Did you faint?
I would have been there. I was at the Village Temple
Yeah.
before in 1987.
I was too, yes.
1987, yeah. And we got married January 88.
Well, so they were all there to celebrate your engagement. That's great.
I don't think Michael spoke yet.
Yes, this Michael.
This Michael.
Yes, that Michael.
I struggle a bit to relate my own history to what you're saying. But in any case, I was thinking of my own history, and I grew up in Delaware, and there's anything that warm or friendly I could say about my high holidays. They were spent in Hebrew at a conservative synagogue in Wilmington, Delaware. I can't remember doing otherwise when I was a child. Probably more interesting were the other holidays, which I would spend in Flushing, Queens with my maternal grandparents, because I was favored there. My maternal grandfather favored me, so I would spend a lot of time up there. And that would be hanging out with these, older Jewish people. My grandfather went to Stuyvesant High School in the 1920s. And so sometimes he would take me with his cronies from Stuyvesant High School in the 1920s, or I would see my great-grandparents from the old country, either Austria or from Bialystok. And that certainly gave me that feel of connection to an old world Judaism. I came from a number of, and back in the old country, everybody was Orthodox, but I did come from some rather Orthodox people, though my grandparents were particularly not Orthodox. So that would be eating the traditional, well, what I thought were traditional foods, which I learned later were, you know, maybe traditional Irish foods or something. But, you know, growing up, I assumed that these were traditional Jewish foods. That would be the story I have to tell.
Well, I think we have heard some very rich stories of varying backgrounds and experiences and food and traditions from our youth coming through our adulthood and still building on all of these aspects of our lives with learning from each other and still more to come. So hopefully our traditions will become not only special to us, but to those with whom we share our holidays. And one way to do that would be to post your traditions or stories on the website so that those who are interested but were not able to participate tonight could benefit from them as well. So I thank you all for joining us and being here tonight, and look forward to seeing you in this lead up and more lead up activities to the high holidays.
Thank you for
Thank you for doing this, Patty.
Thank you,
And
Patty.
thank you, because
Thank you
it
for
did
organizing.
actually bring up a whole lot of conversations, as I said, conversation that would have never been had, you know, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
So, well, thank you all for
Take
sharing.
care.
Okay, good
Bye-bye.
night.